But this morning, the tension that we're navigating through or talking about is the tensions throughout the writings of Solomon. And especially as it comes to Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And right away, you probably recognize the tension that exists between those. If you're familiar at all with either of those books, you probably can already think about some of the ways that they kind of combat each other, or maybe we could say balance each other out. But that's what we're exploring this morning. And they're both a part of what we call the wisdom literature. And they're both primarily authored, or at least most scholars seem to believe, primarily authored by Solomon. And yet they offer two very different perspectives. They're sort of seeing life almost through two different lenses. And it's really interesting, really curious, and I think realizing the two can be extremely helpful. Not just studying these two separately, but allowing them to come together and work together and maybe give us a fuller picture by looking through each of these lenses. So that's what we'll talk about in just a moment, but Randy, if you'll go ahead and... All right, so let's start just by looking at Proverbs. So Proverbs, they're not, as you know, they're not these direct commands, and they're also not exactly like rules or like necessary like promises, guaranteed promises. But they offer a kind of wisdom that, like, the deeper you look into it, the more true you realize they actually are. And the more ways you see them become true in reality. As you observe life, the Proverbs that you read, you observe people and you observe the way that relationships work and the world operates, these Proverbs that we keep in our mind become more and more true over time, or we realize them to be more and more true over time. And so one example that I've heard of this that maybe you've heard before is these Proverbs, these bits of wisdom, these short sayings, aren't so much like a chip that you can bite down on and swallow, or popcorn that you consume. It's more like hard candy, where you think about it as chewing gum, where they're to be ruminated on, they're to be meditated on and reflected on, and through that we come to grasp their truth even more. And right at the outset of Proverbs, if you want to turn just to Proverbs 1, we'll read there in just a moment from Proverbs 1. But these Proverbs, what they're essentially all getting at, they're sometimes we even refer to it this way, they're bits of wisdom. As we read these first 7 verses, I just want to read this together, and then I want to just ask, what are some of the synonyms, I guess we could say, or what are some of the words that are associated with wisdom here in just these first 7 verses? Here, the writer packs so much into this one section, and it kind of works as an introduction into the rest of the book, what we're to expect out of the rest of it. And so he says, beginning in verse 1, again, as we look to some of these synonyms or these parallels, or the words that go along with this word wisdom. Let me get to the right book. He says, this is the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. He says it's to know or to gain wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. All right, so just in these first 7 verses, let's just sort of name these things. Let's just call them out. What are some of the words that are associated with wisdom, that sort of work synonymously as Solomon points to where the rest of this book is headed? What are some of the words that go right alongside wisdom? Insight, yeah. So the ability to perceive and to distinguish. It's interesting, the word kind of has to do with like distinguishing between like shades. So life isn't always just black and white. It comes in many different colors, and we need insight. So insight, what's another one of the words that is mentioned there? Goes along with wisdom. Prudence, yeah. So prudence, not a word that we use quite as often as insight maybe, but this is kind of getting at the idea of like living strategically. There's a lot of that we see unfold throughout Proverbs, strategic living. What else stands out? Guidance, yeah. Being able to navigate a world that is sometimes confusing, disorienting. Any other words that stand out? Discretion, knowledge. One that I think it was, the second word there is instruction. So this idea of like training and kind of getting at the idea of guidance, but along with this accountability. And so here are all these words that sort of fill in, okay, what is Proverbs about? What are we stepping into? This strategic living, living with insight and the ability to perceive. And then he gets to verse 7, and verse 7 is really interesting to me. All these words, instruction, insight, prudence, knowledge, discretion, learning, all the ones that we mentioned, they're all essentially about how to live the best life. But then in verse 7, it's interesting. He sets forth this kind of contrast. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Okay, so here in verse 7, he sets forth this contrast. And what is it that is being contrasted here? Of course, it's the wise and the fool, but what is it about like their character? What is it about their like way of being that is contrasted here?
Well, if you have fear of the Lord, you have full dependence on the Lord in your attitude and your service. If you're a fool, you don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the fear of the Lord, God, he's the creator of the universe. What an awesome truth to behold. And that should bring us to our knees. That should humble us. And that brings us under his guidance. Recognizing that there is a creator, and he has revealed to us wisdom, and we can use that to navigate through life and discover what the best life is. It's living according to his way versus, like you mentioned, in contrast, the fool is pride in oneself. Or just to put this on the screen, the wise person is the one who fears the Lord, who follows his way, trusting in him, depending on him. But the fool is about the pride in oneself and one's own way, one's own ability to determine good and bad, good and evil. And what Proverbs is getting at, what we'll see as we kind of trace this throughout, is that in Proverbs the point is that the fear of the Lord leads to life in abundance, life as it's meant to be lived, what it really means to be human, while pride in oneself leads to ruin, however small or great that might be. Right, so some of the things in Proverbs don't seem like big, monumental kinds of decisions. But the point is that the fear of the Lord leads to life And pride in one's self leads to ruin, however great or small that step in one direction or the other might be. But every decision leads in one direction or another.
Jared, I think that's a really good point. That you think about it, we often use the word worldview. You know, you think, are you going to have God at the center, or am I at the center? And there's a constant battle going on with all of us, I think, in that regard. But he's saying, look, putting God at the center there's nothing more foundational than that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's either God at the center or myself at the center. And that's such a good way of putting it. Yeah, God at the center leads to life, just like it was communing with God in the garden and their taking of the tree of life, and focusing on myself, right? Taking of the tree of knowing good and bad for myself leads to ruin. And so let's just consider some examples of this as we look throughout the book. And these are just kind of chosen at random. I just pretty much did a Google search and just picked some ones that stood out to me. Proverbs 3, 5 through 6, and a lot of these we'll be familiar with. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. And that gets exactly at what you were talking about, Brian. But as we go along, notice what do we observe? What is kind of some of the common threads that run throughout these? They're all maybe very different. They deal with different circumstances and situations in life and relationships. But I think there's something that kind of ties these together. So moving on, Proverbs 3, 9 through 10, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. Another one, Proverbs 9, verse 8, do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Proverbs 12 and verse 11, those who work their land will have abundant food, but those who chase fantasies have no sense. Proverbs 14:12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And then I think this is the last one, Proverbs 18:12, before destruction a man's heart is haughty, but humility comes before honor. All right, so what are, or actually there's one more. Train up a child in the way that he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. And so let's ask the question, okay, what can we observe? Like, is there something that kind of seems to tie these together? Of course, they're all Proverbs. They're all dealing with wisdom. They're all dealing with all these other words of insight and guidance and prudence and these different words. But what is it that is consistent throughout all of these Proverbs? And I think one thing would be the practicality of them. They're very practical. They're very fundamental, day-to-day living in my everyday walk of life. These are things that we're constantly dealing with. They're very practical. And not only practical in that we see them maybe occur often, or we find ourselves in these situations often, but they're practical in the sense that they make sense. When you think about them, it's like, maybe you didn't put it in those words as, just as eloquently as Solomon, but it's like, yes, that's right. It's like you already maybe even knew that within, but it's like, yeah, that makes sense. And like we mentioned before, it's like the more you think about it, the more it does make sense as you observe the world. So they're very practical. But the other thing that we might observe about them is their predictability. Notice he especially you notice this with let's go back just to that first one. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him. And it's almost like almost formulaic, and he will make your path straight. When you do this will happen. And the same true with the other one. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with your first fruits, and boom, vats bursting with wine, barns filled with plenty. And you see that kind of consistency throughout these, that they're not only very practical, but they're set forth as sort of these predictable ways of living, that when you live in this way, this is what will come of it. And this, in a lot of ways, is what the very word wisdom is in some way getting at. So the word wisdom, this was fun studying this again in the high school class last summer. I don't know if Kyle Pearson is in here, but I think he taught on this class the sort of introduction in the high school class to wisdom. But there's this Hebrew word chokmah. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's more than just about gaining knowledge. It's more than just even necessarily just about knowledge put into action. That's kind of like the second level definition that we sometimes give to wisdom, like knowledge in action. But it's more than that. Knowledge or wisdom or chokmah is an attribute of God that is which he used to create the world, and that he wove into the fabric of the universe. And wisdom is like a tool that we can tap into for guidance and for creativity to rule the world in the likeness of God's image. So I want to state that again. Wisdom is an attribute of God that he used to create the world and that he wove into the fabric of the universe. And it becomes a tool that we can tap into for guidance and creativity to rule the world in the likeness of his image. And there's a really interesting way that comes out in Proverbs 8. Proverbs 8 verse 22 says, the Lord, speaking of wisdom, this is wisdom personified in Proverbs 8. It's amazing. But the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. And it goes on to describe how before the mountains had been shaped, I was brought forth. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he made the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned the sea its limits, it's everything, every act of creation. Verse 30, then I was beside him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the children of man. That's just an amazing passage to me of wisdom personified. But I think that helps us understand a lot of what Proverbs is getting at. There is a kind of clear structure to reality. There's a clear way in which the world was made. And so when I live my life with wisdom, then the direct result, almost as if it's an equation, this direct outcome is that good will follow from it. Now that's not always true throughout Proverbs. There are some parts of Proverbs that maybe fill in a little bit more of the picture and maybe lean a little bit more toward an Ecclesiastes lens. But generally speaking, that's the lens that Proverbs is looking through. Life makes sense. God has structured reality in a way that I can use wisdom to navigate through it and to create within it, to rule in the likeness of his image. And if I do that, that's the best life. And the outcome will prove fruitful. But then what about Ecclesiastes? In Ecclesiastes, we kind of get a bit of a different perspective. And I'll go ahead and ask, there are these two phrases that come up a lot throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. One of them I just gave away. But what would you say are the two sort of main phrases? When you think about the times that you've read through and studied Ecclesiastes, what are some of the maybe two key phrases that we see that come up over and over again?
Striving after wind.
Striving after the wind, vanity. No one wants to say it because I already showed it. Under the sun. Yeah. And these two, I think, provide sort of the under the sun and the vanity of vanities provide a helpful sort of understanding of what the whole book is about. Under the sun, this phrase comes up almost 30 times throughout the book. Over and over again, we see this phrase, under the sun, under the sun. And it acts as kind of the setting for the whole book. And he says toward the beginning in 1 and verse 3, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Or he says in verse 13, I applied my heart to seek and search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven or under the sun. And I didn't even include in that count the phrases like under heaven or the one. That's just under the sun is 30 times. And then there's phrases like this, under heaven. But when you think about Solomon, right? So we have sort of the Proverbs view that Solomon is looking through. And then we have this Ecclesiastes view. And he's looking at life under the sun. He observes reality and he comes to a slightly different conclusion. He still talks about the fear of the Lord, but it's almost like sometimes reality is not so predictable. Sometimes reality under the sun, under heaven, is extremely difficult to navigate. And he asks this question back in verse 3, what does a man gain by all this toil? And there he's not just talking about like work and labor, but just like the toiling of life, existence. What does a man gain by all this toil at which he toils under the sun? And that's a question that I think every person asks. All of us are asking this question. What's the gain? What's the meaning? And so he applies his heart to search out wisdom of all that's done under heaven. To answer that question, is there a rhyme and a reason to all this? And just real quick, what are some of the ways that he goes about trying to seek that out? He says, I apply my heart to seek it and to search it out, everything that's done under the sun. What are some of the things that he applies his heart to try and find this sort of, maybe we could say, this meaning under the sun? You remember any of the things that he mentions throughout the book? Learning. Yeah, he pours himself, he asks God to grant him wisdom. And so that's really like the first place he goes. Maybe this sort of meaning, maybe this rhyme and reason can be discovered in the pursuit of knowledge. And what he comes to find is that, well, with much knowledge or much learning comes vexation and this weariness of the heart. What's lacking can't be counted, what's crooked can't be made straight, and you can just feel his frustration. What are some of the other ones that he mentions? So knowledge, the pursuit of wisdom. Self-indulgence, right. Yeah, there in, especially there in chapter 2, I mean, it's just like he tries absolutely everything, every kind of pleasure, every kind of thing that would satisfy his heart. He just one after the other goes down the line, checking off every box that we could imagine, every pursuit. He goes after it, he chases after it, tries to fill himself with the desires of his heart, and he comes up with this same conclusion. Verse 10 of chapter 2, whatever my eyes desired did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for my toil. He considered it, and he looked at it, and in verse 11, behold, it was all vanity. It was all striving after the wind. But are there any other? So there's knowledge, there's this self-indulgence, this pursuit of like hedonistic pleasure. Are there any other things that he mentions?
Big building projects.
Yeah, big building projects that bring greatness and prestige to himself, a sense of accomplishment. So maybe we're not out here building temples, but we're building careers and we're building some kind of platform to raise ourselves up on, to make ourselves feel accomplished. And the same conclusion for Solomon is it profited nothing. Are there any others that he mentions? I mean, we could probably go on for the rest of the class, but maybe let's get like one or two more.
Lots of animals, and not just sheep and goats, it eventually gets to monkeys and peacocks.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I didn't really look into that one that too much. I don't have like a strong inclination toward like I don't know, maybe he's like, all right, I'm going to be Adam 2.0, you know, get all the, I don't know what's good. But he has these sort of like exotic interests, these experiences that he's seeking after. I thought I heard another.
I was just gonna say, one of the things he observed,
Yeah.
you know, he just was trying to observe every facet of life and every stage and all different types of people.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's like just observation in general. Like, if I just observe, maybe this will make sense. And he's like, under the sun, this is just so perplexing and maybe even disappointing. He talks about wealth and honor. He talks about some other things. He even talks about like enjoying the simple little things in life. And if there's one kind of glimmer of hope that Solomon offers throughout the book, that's it. It's like enjoy the little things. Enjoy the gifts that God has given you. And he gives you the power to enjoy them. But even to that, he comes back around to saying, but even this is like, is this really it? Is this, it's almost like you can still feel him like just come up empty. And so the phrase that we mentioned from before, this verse I think nails it on the head really well. Again, I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor the bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. So Proverbs sort of has this lens that there's a structure to reality, and there's this clear like A to Z outcome. Do this, this will happen. And he says, but when I observed under the sun, this is what I found, that that's not how life tends to play out. There's time and chance. It's not exactly always practical. It doesn't always make sense. It's not always predictable. It doesn't happen in the way that you expect it to. And so you can feel his frustration where he says, all is vanity. Verse 2 of chapter 1, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. And it's interesting, that's the first word that he says, and then in chapter 12, it's the last word that the preacher says. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. So here's the bookends. And you can feel his angst and frustration, even through the glimmers of hope that are kind of woven throughout the book. And this is his sort of conclusion. And this word vanity, sometimes we, in fact, in a lot of translations, like I think in the ESV, which is the one I'm reading from, so I should know it, I think it's mostly translated meaningless. Other versions say like futility. The word vanity, in fact, it's helpful to pair it with someone mentioned before, the striving after the wind. That provides a really helpful picture. It's breath, it's vapor, it's wind. And what I think that gets at is that as Solomon experiences life under the sun, what are the ways in which life is like that? That it's vaporous and shifting. It's like a fog. It's fleeting, right? A vapor is here for a little while and then it vanishes away. It's unpredictable, like we mentioned before, and it's so elusive. It's like impossible to grab onto. And so when Solomon says this, he's not necessarily saying that life is meaningless. He's not necessarily, this is the conclusion I've come to, that life has no meaning. It's more like he's saying the meaning of it always seems to slip out of our reach. And it disappears, and it's shifting, and it's confusing and disorienting, and because of that, it's so frustrating and disappointing at times. No matter where it is I turn to, it always seems to slip away. And so here's the contrast. Normally we kind of lay it right out at the beginning, but I wanted to just kind of walk through both of those first. And then state this. So Proverbs, it's like there's this structure to reality. And wisdom is like a tool used to both navigate and create within that reality in practical and predictable ways. But then Ecclesiastes, the lens that it works through is, well, sometimes reality is much more like a fog, where it's confusing and frustrating and elusive. And so I want to allow this to lead us into a discussion now, and I want to start just by asking, I don't think it will embarrass us, like raise our hands. Which of these two views do you feel more like connected with, or do you relate to more? It's okay. Like, I mean, we're all going to be like, oh, if your Proverbs, you're like super optimistic, and if your Ecclesiastes, you just like hate the world or something. No one's going to think that, but raise your hand if the lens that Proverbs looks through feels a little more like relatable to you. Okay. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I see some more hands now. So if you raise your hand and you didn't see anybody else, you're not alone. There were a lot of hands. That's good. Now, what about, raise your hand for Ecclesiastes, if that seems to be a little more. Okay. I totally am judging all of y'all right now.
Depends on what time of day.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the point. In fact, I don't know, I might be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure I saw people raise their hand twice, and that's how I feel. It's like there are different seasons of life where one of these feels more relatable. But let's allow that to lead us into this first question, which I guess is two questions. But first of all, why do you think we have these two different perspectives on reality? And then the second question being, in what ways can they be reconciled? In what way can we sort of reconcile these two perspectives? So let's focus on just that first part. Just as you have read these, and we've just briefly sort of overviewed these this morning, why do you think we have these two different perspectives on reality? Why do you think these are in the Holy Scriptures for us?
You have the flesh and you have the spirit, and they just clash.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's this internal struggle between the flesh and the spirit, and we feel it all the time, and that comes out in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. What else? Sorry, I saw it.
You can't expect a one-dimensional reality when it comes from a multidimensional God. There are going to be nuances and facets and differences and consequences and all of that because God created it.
Absolutely. I really like that statement. You can't expect one-dimensional reality
from a multidimensional God.
I think, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and Proverbs kind of goes along with Ecclesiastes chapter 8, 10 through 13. I'll just read a portion of that. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. So I feel like, that's a similar idea in both the books.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that gets at a good way in which these can be reconciled. In fact, you remember the very end of Proverbs, of Ecclesiastes, the sort of compiler of Solomon's thoughts sort of draws, I don't know if it's so much his own conclusion or he looks at Solomon and says, here's how I would summarize what Solomon's saying. There's some debate on that, but you remember what he says, the end of the matter, when all has been heard, fear God, keep his commandments wait. I think I read the wrong part. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Sorry, my eyes like just cross-eyed there. For this is the whole duty of man. Or other versions say, this is man's all. This is what life is about. What do we gain from all the toil which we toil under the sun? Well, man's all is discovered in aligning my life with the wisdom of God, because he is the creator. And when we think about it that way, it's, I don't know, I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but it's like when we think about the law, sometimes we sort of butt up against it because we're like, man, I want to live my own way. Like, I want me at the center. But if there really is a creator and he really has formed the world and structured the world in a meaningful way, and he has actually revealed his divine law for us about what it means to be human, then would that not be exactly where the meaning of life is found, in aligning my life with the way in which the Creator intended it to be? And so, yeah, so there's definitely ways that we can reconcile this. Any other thoughts on either of these questions? Like, why do you think we have this? What kind of gift does it offer? How can they be reconciled?
Kind of riffing a little bit off what Dan said, that you think about Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. God set up the world, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, much of what you see in Genesis 2, we still have, but we're not in the garden anymore. And God intentionally in Genesis 3 then says, okay, you are going to face trouble. Now, again, it didn't turn everything on its head. It doesn't mean everything that was set up flew out the window, but we're going to face troubles. And sometimes we're going to plant things that thorns come up. And husbands and wives will sometimes have conflict, and brothers like Cain and Abel, and things that you didn't see. And so I think we see this beginning at the, with sin comes Ecclesiastes.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's such a great point. I think it does go back to the garden, just as like all good stories, all good theology, all good lessons begin in Genesis 1 through 3. But there is this idea, it's almost like Proverbs is like, that's the way in which God intends things to operate, and we live in a world that is corrupted by sin and cursed by sin. And so, like you said, sometimes we're going to work hard and thorns are going to come up, and it's going to be that sort of frustrating toil that Solomon is talking about in Ecclesiastes. Any other thought? I saw one.
I think along with all that, which was great, there's also this idea of, we bear the image of God, and we should be able to work within His creation and leverage its laws and principles in such a way that are beneficial, and we see that in Proverbs, but God also wants to remind us that our control over everything is not total. And so there's a remainder that exists outside our field of ability to manipulate and control things, and that's Ecclesiastes, because we need to remember that God is God and we're not.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting. Like sometimes when we read Proverbs, or maybe just like our natural intuition in life is like, this can be controlled. I can control my situation, or sometimes I can maybe even manipulate reality to favor me. And Ecclesiastes is like, that is not the way that the world works. There's a phrase, you can't twist the fabric of reality without having it snap back at you. And maybe that gets at a little bit of both Proverbs and Ecclesiastes there, a kind of intersection. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. Any other thoughts on that?
In Ecclesiastes 3, it says, He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity in man's heart.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've been given by God, but I don't understand it hardly because I can't see it. So I've got to find out all these things to gain that wisdom through my experiences and my mistakes in life, I guess, seeking.
Yeah.
Yet so that, what Lawrence said there, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know, it's kind of futile for me to take, but to seek God, I guess, and like someone else said, that's the beginning of wisdom.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a good point. Maybe I should have used that as one of like the key verses, because that really does illuminate it so well. And it's interesting, yeah, this, I don't know, maybe some of you would be able to comment better on what that phrase means, like the setting of eternity in man's heart. But whatever it does mean, at least in part, means there's this like inner longing, there's this desire for that sense, like, okay, surely there's more out there. Surely this has greater meaning than what I'm experiencing, what I'm going through. and it's just engraved within our hearts. We have this hunger for it. Let's get one more thought, and then we'll. Or I thought I saw another hand, but maybe not. That's okay. So here's these two sort of competing lenses, or maybe when we use them together, they actually prove to be really helpful. And I think that's the way that these two perspectives can be reconciled. I think throughout both of the texts, there's reasonable ways to reconcile both. They both kind of seem to play off one another. It's almost like the same author wrote it or Spirit inspired it. But it probably hits us at different phases as well, different situations, different circumstances. Like, isn't it such a blessing to have this? It's almost like going to the Psalms and we experience the emotions of the writers, and that can be true of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. But then ultimately, I think we should rest in the tension. I think we should not really try to reconcile these and just realize, hey, this is just life. There are these two things that happen, and I don't know how to make sense of all of them. I don't know how to reconcile these two different perspectives. But as I sit in that tension, I have this longing for it to be resolved by God. And just briefly, isn't that in large part what Job is about, the other main book of the wisdom literature? Like life's, he was a good person, good outcome, exactly what you would expect. Proverbs, and then boom, Ecclesiastes. Things happen that are totally outside of his control, and he's totally confused. And in his it's like his core longing is maybe we could summarize it by saying his desire that God could become man, that he could commune with him and talk to him as a friend, because this is totally unexplainable. And it's interesting. I know the bell's about to ring here, but it's interesting. I'll just say this. The Greeks had an idea that sounds very similar to Proverbs. There's a structure to reality, and if I align my life to this wisdom, if I tap into this wisdom, then that's the way in which life can be lived. And that's really what is like the driving thrust behind a lot of the philosophers. If I align my life to it, the word that they used was called the Logos. And John 1:1 says this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that word is Logos. Right? This transcendent reality, it's not just some abstract idea that I align my life with. It actually came down. It actually took on flesh. The Word took on flesh and it dwelt among us. All things were made through him, just like Proverbs 8 was talking about with this personified wisdom. And without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. So through the confusion, through the tension between these two books, Jesus has come down. He has taken on flesh. He is the Logos, the wisdom that we align our life with. And what an awesome, amazing blessing that is. I appreciate all the thoughts and comments. Homework is go on YouTube, type in Proverbs Bible Project. You'll see a really, really helpful, good video. Thank you so much.